My name is Sue Gives a Fuck, and I really do. I'm a comedian, but I'm not actually going to be doing comedy today. Instead, what I'm going to be doing is responding to a letter. Now, if you've looked at J.K. Rowling's Twitter feed any time in about the last year, you'll have noticed that bubbling beneath the charity work and the children's drawing competitions, there lurks a surprisingly persistent interest in trans issues. It's been clear for around about a year that Rowling has had something to say. Well, last week, at almost exactly the same time that the US and UK governments announced rollbacks of trans rights, she decided to say it. I'm a trans person. JK is not a trans person, but that does not mean that she's not welcome in this debate. In fact, she's welcome everywhere. That's how privilege works. In a piece uploaded to her website and then shared widely, Rowling gives 5 reasons why she's so concerned about the advance of trans rights. Abbreviated, they are as follows. 1. Her work with charities may be affected by any changes to the legal definitions of sex and gender. 2. She wants to protect children. 3. She wants to defend freedom of speech. 4. She's concerned that children and young women in particular are being persuaded into transitioning. And 5, she worries that allowing trans people into single-sex spaces will result in women being assaulted. In what follows, I plan to address her concerns. Now, Rowling simply states points 1 to 3 without offering any arguments. There's not a lot that I can do with those. Point 2 is pretty much covered in point 4, which I will cover at length, however. But it's clear that the final 2 concerns are what she came to express, and those are the points that her piece is dedicated to justifying. I'm going to take each of them in turn. I'd like to note that I'll provide sources for any claims that I make. In her piece, Rowling frequently refers to the extensive research that she's conducted, but she decides not to include any of that. I genuinely thought that the gay rights movement had dealt with this one. Fear that kids would be corrupted and turn gay was the reasoning behind Proposition 28, it was the justification for chemical castrations, and rearing its head again, it's now the reason that Trump wants to stop gays from adopting. So let's have a little look at J.K. Rowling's new and updated version. Rowling cites a 2018 study by author Lisa Littman that coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, this study purported to show that it was common for whole peer groups of children to start identifying as trans at around about the same time, proving that trans identities often emerge out of social pressure and not due to some innate identity. Rowling's fear is that children who would otherwise grow out of their gender dysphoria will be rushed into procedures that are all too often irreversible. She writes of the increasing numbers who seem to be detransitioning, returning to their original sex, because they regret taking steps that have, in some cases, altered their bodies irrevocably and taken away their fertility. This danger is very real, Rowling argues, because it's now far too easy to change your gender without proper consideration. She writes, "The current explosion of trans activism is urging a removal of almost all the robust systems through which candidates for sex reassignment were once required to pass. A man who intends to have no surgery and take no hormones may now secure himself a gender recognition certificate and be a woman in the sight of the law. Many people aren't aware of this." Well, Rowling's argument is that it's too easy for children to make irreversible medical changes. And by way of evidence for that, she's pointed to gender recognition certificates, which are neither medical nor irreversible. In fact, the easier it is to change your legal gender, the easier it is to change it back. So that seems to be that. But why then has she mentioned these certificates at all? See, she was in need of some evidence to back up her argument that kids are rushing into sex reassignment without proper consideration. Now, of course, she knew exactly what evidence she needed. She'd already mentioned the increasing numbers who seem to be detransitioning. All she needed to do was provide that number. Demonstrate that a worrying number of people are indeed regretting transitioning, and you've proven that kids are rushing into it. So what is that number? The most comprehensive data that we have is from a 2018 survey of World Professional Association for Transgender Health Surgeons. This found that 0.3% of patients who underwent transition-related surgery later requested detransition-related surgical care. 0.3%. 0.3%. Now, that's not really the evidence that Rowling needed, is it? But the thing is, if your first sentence in a paragraph makes a claim about gender, and the second sentence provides a fact about gender, then you've used the structure of a well-reasoned argument. So, she included a different fact about gender. Does it support the argument? Of course not. Will an absent-minded Potter fan notice? No. I'm not accusing J.K. Rowling of willfully misleading people. I'm accusing her of intellectual laziness, which often creeps in when people speak authoritatively on subjects that they have no expertise in. The problem is, when your expertise lies in writing, you can usually convince people anyway. I see Jennifer Saunders has just retweeted it. Lovely. She opened Pride a few years ago. Okay, so she hasn't proved that kids are being rushed into irreversible medical changes, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. Kids do go through phases, kids are influenced by their peers and the media that they consume, and if we operate on a child just because they say that they're trans, surely that's going to sometimes lead to mistakes. Well, the first thing to point out is that most authorities on the subject agree that gender identity is usually fixed by around age 3 and is extremely difficult to change after that. However, my experience and the experience of many other trans people I know suggests that gender identity is fluid. And with that in mind, I agree that external forces might influence that identity. I agree further that sometimes children will experience short-lived gender dysphoria and that it would be a mistake to perform irreversible medical procedures on them. So let's do the work that JK didn't bother to do and examine whether that's what actually happens. In the UK, when a child goes to a GP to talk about gender dysphoria, they'll be referred to a gender identity clinic. The wait will be at least 2 years. After their first appointment at that clinic, they'll receive psychological assessment in several sessions over a period of several months. They'll then usually be referred to some kind of talking therapy, and the wait for that can vary depending on the type of support that's been chosen. Then, they may be referred to an endocrinologist who will assess their suitability for hormone blockers. What percentage of young people referred to the gender identity clinic in the first place reach that stage and are put on hormone blockers? 2.3%. That's according to the Tavistock Centre, which is the leading gender identity clinic in the UK. And hormone blockers are completely reversible. The reason that people take them is to postpone or limit the effects of puberty in order to give young people the time to explore their gender before the largely irreversible effects of their natural hormones kick in. For example, giving you a jaw so wide that your head is basically a semicircle. When you come off hormone blockers, you go through puberty just a little bit later than you otherwise would have. From the age of 16, teenagers who've been on hormone blockers for at least 12 months may be given cross-sex hormones, or also known as gender-affirming hormones. If you choose to come off those hormones, their effects may be reversed or there may be some changes that remain. We're now around year 4 into the process, and we're down to about 2% of referrals. The minimum age for gender-confirming surgery is 18, and by that stage we're likely to be on year 6 of the process and down to about 1% of referrals. So after an average 4 to 6 years, between 1 and 2% of young people who see a GP for gender dysphoria will make irreversible change. And J.K. Rowling thinks that that process is too easy? I'm on year 2 and I've not had an appointment. As a final note on this point, I'd like to make clear that the report Rowling is referring to does not use valid scientific methodology. It claims to show people transitioning due to peer pressure, and to reach that conclusion, it uses a survey. So in that survey, did trans people confess that they'd transitioned due to peer pressure? No, she didn't ask them. She asked their parents. She asked their parents why they thought their kids had transitioned, and where did she find those parents? On gender-critical websites. She literally asked transphobic parents, what do you think of this whole trans business that your kid's going through? Also, just FYI, none of the trans people who were sort of not quite included in this study have medically transitioned and then regretted it. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Rowling writes, when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels that he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. Anyone who has transitioned, or considered transitioning, or explored their gender identity in any way, or known and loved any trans people will have come up against and will have defeated this argument. The fact that Rowling thinks that this argument is relevant is testament to just how ill-equipped she is to talk on this issue. In support of this argument, Rowling doesn't even pretend to offer evidence, and yet again it's because there is none. No man has ever popped on a frock, nipped into the women's changing rooms at H&M and assaulted someone. It doesn't happen. And why doesn't it happen? Because men don't need to do that. The reason that rape is a feminist issue is because it disproportionately affects women. And the reason that it disproportionately affects women is because men feel entitled to women's bodies. Rape and sexual assault are committed at home by partners, or in nightclubs by friends, or in workplaces by colleagues. And the same patriarchal ideas that make rape endemic make the men who do it unwilling to pop on a frock and go into a women's changing room. The more likely a man is to rape, the less likely he is to cross-dress his way into female spaces. Those are just the rules of patriarchy. Instead of evidence, Rowling offers her personal story. She is the survivor of what sounds like horrendous sexual assault and domestic abuse. I'd like to commend her bravery for talking openly about that experience. I don't know whether she spotted it, but for a few years, a grassroots campaign has existed that could really have used that story, the Me Too movement. But she hasn't told this story as part of the Me Too movement. She's applied it in the trans debate. Why? Did a trans person assault her? Was she domestically abused by a trans person? No, of course she wasn't. Her abuser was a cis man, as almost all of them are. But she doesn't use this story as a chance to talk about men, or masculinity, or patriarchy. She uses it to talk about trans women. She uses it to insinuate that trans women are predators rather than the women of all women who are most vulnerable to sexual assault and abuse. For the sake of argument, let's ask, isn't it at least conceivable that if changing rooms are trans inclusive, a man might call himself a trans woman and use his access to women's changing rooms in order to rape women? Yes. Here's a scenario that's also conceivable. If access to changing rooms is determined by the gender that you were assigned at birth, then trans men will have to use women's changing rooms, regardless of whether they identify as a man, regardless of whether they're read as a man by most people. So is it not conceivable that a man could call himself a trans man to gain access to women's changing rooms and then use that access to assault women? Well, yes, of course it's conceivable. It's also conceivable that a terrorist could strap a bomb to a pigeon, but pigeons are not the main threat to society. This argument is so contemptibly poor that it would be shocking to hear a person of Rowling's intelligence and compassion using it if we hadn't seen arguments exactly like this one used by earnest and intelligent people time and time again. These arguments are never about evidence, and they are always about fear of change. Members of minority groups are often stereotyped as representing a danger to the majority's most vulnerable members. Jews in the Middle Ages were accused of murdering Christian babies in ritual sacrifices. Black men in the United States were lynched after being falsely accused of raping white women. And gay people have often been portrayed as predators and as threats to children. Back in 1977, for example, when Anita Bryant campaigned successfully to repeal a Dade County ordinance prohibiting anti-gay discrimination, she named her organisation Save Our Children, and she warned that a particularly deviant-minded teacher could sexually molest children. In this country, the idea of the gay predator justified the exclusion of gays from the military and is the foundation of the gay panic defence that has seen homophobic killers escape murder convictions. The backs against the wall lads attitude that gay men are seeking to take advantage of straight men has been featured in every long-running comedy show I can think of up to about 2005. You may think that that attitude has died, but let me tell you, as a stand-up comedian on the comedy circuit, it hasn't. This is in spite of the fact that research on child sexual abuse shows that most instances of child sexual abuse, and one study cited the percentage being at over 90%, are perpetrated by heterosexual males raping underage females, and that 91% of all rape victims are women. So why throughout so much of the 20th century were people disproportionately scared of sexual assault by gay men? Because gays challenged the status quo. The gay rights movement challenged the certainty and dominance of straight people. The desire of gay men for justice threatened to undermine the privileges enjoyed by straights. Incidentally, gay women were usually considered less scary, partly because the optics of the gay rights movement were so often dominated by gay men, and partly because old-fashioned misogyny says women aren't as much of a threat. The desires of gay men were unnatural, in the sense of defying the natural order of society, in the sense of defying the status quo. The desires of gay men were to be feared. And who needs to be protected from threatening desires? Our poor defenceless bairns. Nowadays, cisgender heterosexuals fear that the desire of trans people for justice threatens the dominance that they've always enjoyed. Will the world stop looking so much like them? Will they have to change their jokes and learn new words? Will they have to change their morals? So the desires of trans people are to be feared, cis-het people are afraid. So they look to their vulnerable women and their children. What of our delicate ladies, our poor damsels, and our helpless poor bairns? They'll never cope with such change. It's a smokescreen. Things have changed, things will continue to change, women and children will cope, J.K. Rowling will be fine. Rowling has been the target of much anger and abuse, and while I share that anger, I do not wish to add to the abuse. In everything that she's written on the subject, Rowling has been measured and respectful. I do not believe that she's speaking out of hatred. I believe that she sincerely feels that women and children need to be protected, and she's using her voice in an effort to do that. I also believe that those opposed to the gay rights movement genuinely believe that children were at risk of being made gay. I believe that those opposed to the civil rights movement genuinely believe that white women were at risk of being assaulted. Prejudice is usually sincere, and it usually means well. J.K. Rowling, I implore you to see it in yourself.